that Sergey Brin said, and with our algorithm, with PageRank, we can't be spammed.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, you might regret saying that, believe me, because from then on, it was game on with Google, and I don't think that even they realized just how bad it was going to be. I actually was the person who coined the term black hat. We'll come back to that in a second if you want. Doing all of these nefarious things, bait and switch, and all of these kind of things that people were now saying you shouldn't do because it's against Google's guidelines. Yeah, to everybody else, they're SEOs. To me, they're CEA, content experience analysts. That's the job. That's what they do. And I realized that my coal black hat had turned snowy white.
And welcome to another episode in the Pioneers series. Today, I'm incredibly excited to be talking to Mike Grehan, who was right at the beginning of the early days of SEO, and I'm sure Mike's got some amazing stories to tell us. Just before we do kick in, Mike, I just wanted to ask you very quickly, if this is true, a little something I heard from a mutual friend of ours. Is it true that you started the first in-store radio at Topshop?
Wow. I wonder which mutual friend that was. Yes, I was one of the very first DJs. Radio Topshop was developed by me and a guy called Steve Collins in London. And I don't know if they've told you the full story, but the first DJ that we employed together was a cocky young kid. He sent a demo tape on a cassette to us, and I thought, great voice, but he does sound a bit cocky anyway. His name is Paul McKenna, and he's the world's most famous hypnotist. I gave Paul his very first job, and strange enough, he and I were just chatting to each other last week because he has the best-selling book in the UK at the moment, Positivity.
So, Mike, I'm sure you've got a lot of fascinating stories to tell. So, just to start out with, if you just want to introduce and tell us, when did you actually get started? What was the path that led you into online digital marketing?
So I guess around 1994, I was the director of a PR agency. The early part of my career, I don't know if Ammon mentioned it, but I was actually a radio DJ in the UK for 10 years. I worked in radio and television. And then because early on in my career, I had dropped out of uni and I was doing a master's degree, and I went back and finished my master's degree in marketing. That's how I ended up working in advertising. This sounds a little bit convoluted, but during the course of the period that I worked in radio and television, I used to voice a lot of radio and TV commercials. That's what I did on the side. And then I eventually became involved with an advertising agency. And instead of just writing the ads, instead of just voicing the ads, I started writing them. And then eventually, when I finished this degree at university, they offered me a role full-time in the advertising agency. So that's how I transferred out of media into advertising. And then around about 1994, as I say, I mean, I knew the internet was there. I knew what it was. I met a guy who could do this thing called HTML coding, made it sound like he was a wizard. And he was telling me how big he thought the World Wide Web. You have to remember, the internet, the World Wide Web are not the same thing. Mm-hmm. But he was talking about how big he thought that the World Wide Web was going to be. So he and I got to know each other quite well, and he actually taught me how to code very basic stuff. I don't know if you know this, but there were no browsers back then. The browser wars hadn't even started, when they started creating these things. So we used to create our websites using Microsoft Notepad. Notepad, the little, we used to do all of the coding just in a text editor back then. But the reason that he was interesting to me is that he was trying to bolt himself onto the agency and then use us to introduce him to our clients to get them interested. And I just couldn't get the agency interested in the World Wide Web. I mean, they were all literally internet. That'll never work kind of thing, Yeah. It's the truth. I used to hear it all of the time. So 1995, this guy that I met, Tim, he and I peeled off. We left the agency, and in 1995 started an internet marketing consultancy. And when I tell people that, Shelley, they're like, 1995, an internet marketing consultancy. What a visionary. I go, what an idiot. Nobody needed an internet marketing consultancy back then. So,
how long did it take you to get a client?
well, so the interesting part about that is that it wasn't too difficult eventually to get clients if we went in from a different direction. And the different direction was to not try and sell them a website, but was to get them to use email. And the more that so, and it was kind of interesting because, we would introduce these clients to email. People could see the benefit, not the entire benefit, certainly not from a marketing point of view. So we actually started off by registering domains for companies and then setting up the email system. And then I had this thing where we would set up an email system. And then when we finished doing that for the client, I would arrive at the client's office with a little potted plant, and I would take it and put it on the fax machine and say, "You don't need this anymore, by the way." And you know what happened? Obviously, I'd put that on the fax machine and say, "That's all it's good for, holding this potted plant now." And then they would receive their emails and print them. I go, "No, you're missing the point. This is digital. You're wasting. You're killing trees."
So, we're around 1995.
So it's 1995 now.
How did you start to connect to the rest of the sort of the community? What were your first experiences connecting with other people, and who were they?
I'll just fill in one quick short gap first,
sure.
because that was the leap from just doing the email to actually getting people interested in the website. When we first started selling stuff, to build to get a domain and build a web page, which is basically what we were doing. With HTML1 at that point in time, and the way that we were using just text editors, you couldn't put an image in. So we're trying to sell people just a web page with just text, and that's why they couldn't get it. But after a while, we were able to start and introduce an image. So if you could put an image of the managing director in the page, then all of a sudden they wanted a web page, keep the managing director happy. Of course, back in the day with the dial-up, you put a picture of the managing director, and then you go to the web page, you can have 3 cups of coffee and it was still down. So that's how we got started with that. And after a while, we did get a little bit of traction. And by about 1998, there were lots of search engines around, lots of them. They had different names and they came from different kind of directions. But the one that was standing out at the time was called Alta Vista. And Alta Vista was owned by a company called Digital. And the way that they were approaching this is they were going to build the world's supercomputer, like the one you see in all the Bond movies and sci-fi movies. It's the one computer that's going to run the world, kind of thing. And so they were the biggest thing in search. And then what happened is we were making these very basic web pages. I mean, the websites were 2 or 3 pages at the most, with a few images in them. And then I had a client who kept coming to me, and he would say to me, "Mike, I've been to this thing called a search engine, this thing called Alta Vista, and I've been doing a search for products and services, and I can see that my competitors are there, but I can't find me. Why do you think that is, Mike?" I thought, I really have to get an idea on how this search thing works. So that's how I started, like a few other people, and there were maybe it's just a handful of people at the time. And I just started experimenting with pages, doing things, changing them, looking at the pages that were ranking a little bit higher, those that were at the top. Some of them had images, some of them didn't. What on earth was it that was making this happen? And then I eventually realized it was to do with the words on the page. That was the initial phase of search. It was all about words on a page. So I started doing the same as everybody else. I would steal somebody else's page, put it up as mine, and see if that would rank. Just bait and switch. Everybody was doing bait and switch. We thought there was no such thing as spamming then. It was just like, what that one man's spam back then was another man's great tactical move kind of thing, And then in 1998, a guy called Danny Sullivan, who most people who've been in the industry for any length of time will know. So Danny had written a web page, literally a page, which was just called A Webmaster's Guide to Search Engines. And he, like me, and probably 3 or 4, and I mean no more than that, in the industry had been doing all of these things. And then so he switched from this one page and registered searchenginewatch.com and started building, started writing articles around it. So that's when the industry started. And I got to know Danny. And there was a legal case that was going on in the UK. And Danny could correct me. But I heard about this legal case. It was to do with meta tags. And nobody really knew what they were, other than those people who were just gradually getting into this little cottage industry, that meta tags were the magic bullet. If you put meta tags in, you get to #1 at Alta Vista kind of thing, And one company was suing another one because they were using their branded terms in the meta tags. And this was the first time it had ever happened before, So I used the contact form at Search Engine Watch to get in touch with Danny, who had just launched Search Engine Watch. The date escapes me. It was around about that time.
Yeah.
And explained this thing to him. And he was like, wow, this is, can you imagine? This is a big deal. Somebody else is messing around with somebody's meta tags. So he said, can we use this? And I actually became probably one of the first, if not the first contributor to Search Engine Watch when Danny was putting out this newsletter. And then through that, that's basically how the community started, with Search Engine Watch as being the go-to resource. And then for me, the foundation of the industry actually was 1999, when Danny did the very first Search Engine Strategies conference. People can't believe it. But that was the first time. The reason that I say that was the kind of cornerstone of the industry, that was the first time that webmasters, and they weren't SEOs because we weren't called that back then, that webmasters and people from search engines got together in the same place. No, I didn't make the first one, unfortunately. I was the second one.
Right.
Although I did know Danny by then, but anyway, it was a small considering how it grew. But as legend has it, there are these 2 young kids turned up with a carton as a sponsor, and went over to the table and put this carton on the table, opened it up, and they start pulling out these T-shirts with this word Google written on, and people are looking at that going, yeah, best of luck with that, whatever that is. Where's the guy from Alta Vista?
Oh, if only they'd known.
Turns out they've done very well since then.
Just to come back a little bit from that, because I know when I was speaking to Ammon last week, he mentioned something called iSearch, a newsletter.
So iSearch was around. So there were a couple of interesting resources. iSearch was actually an email newsletter. It wasn't online. It was an email subscription newsletter. And Detlef Johnson, who became Deezer and is now back to being Detlef again. But Detlef was the original. Oh, no, he wasn't. He was the second editor. The first editor, it'll come to me in a second. That was around at the time. But I think what you have to remember is there were actually. Do you remember at the very beginning I said that there is a difference between the internet and the World Wide Web? There were actually internet search engines before the World Wide Web, and they were called bizarre names like Jughead and Veronica, believe it or not. Those search engines were only indexing FTP sites. So I was fully aware of that. So, when the World Wide Web started producing these search engines that were crawling the web as opposed to just looking for FTP content, the way that you were accessing those before we had the first browser, you were using Jughead and Veronica and all of those old ones. So I mean, there is a little bit of history before the history of the World Wide Web. Search has been around for a long time.
Well, I mean, search has been, if you go back even further, information retrieval is a fascinating subject, and that's been around for.
So I've been studying that for 24 years now, and I can take it right back to 1960s and Gerard Salton, who was the father of modern information retrieval. But we'll probably work our way around to that, I'm sure.
Yeah. So, so in those early years of, say, you got into you were on online marketing in '95. What were you predominantly doing then at that point up until the search engines? And then as you said, you then realized that it was about the words on the page, and then obviously that progressed to meta tags. But before that, what kind of what things were you doing that actually worked in terms of to promote websites?
So yeah, so that's kind of interesting. There were some resources that started mainly through email.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the best ways to send traffic to your website, and still is, believe me, even after all of these years, was to find like an email publication. So, for instance, even when you mention iSearch, iSearch was one of a whole bunch of, there was iSearch, iDeveloper, I this, I that, I the other, kind of thing. So if you found somebody who had a subscription base, and eventually I did. I was the first guy in search. I know that Danny had the publication. I had 18,000 subscribers to my newsletter. All
Wow.
those, yeah. And so what people would do is obviously try and find a newsletter, email newsletter, where you could surreptitiously just sneak a link into your website. It goes back even that far, yeah. Or you could buy an ad. So predominantly that was the way. And then the other thing was obviously through referrals, or back ending as it was called in those days. So I did a lot of affiliate marketing then, and with the affiliate marketers, and that was quite new at the time, but with the affiliate marketers, what would happen is somebody would sell one of my products, yeah, and then that person who bought it would get an email from them, and in that email would be a link to buy somebody else's product, so it would send them to another website. The loyalty that you can build up in email is the most important thing. And the great thing about email is that when it's anticipate, this is what I've always said, and these words are still important: anticipated, welcome, relevant, and welcome.
Mm-hmm.
In that way, anticipated, relevant, and welcome, which means that I signed up for it. So when I
Mm.
signed up for the Search Engine Watch newsletter,
Mm.
man, I couldn't wait,
Yeah, you
every
were looking
Friday,
for
come
it.
on, let's go.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. What's the news kind of thing. So, even now, anticipated, relevant. Well, I mean, your tax bill is anticipated and relevant, but it's not always welcome.
What was your newsletter called, Mike?
It was called, and it was hyphenated, emarketingnews.co.uk, and it's still there, untouched from 20 odd years ago. If you go, I
Oh.
was so attached to it. And I'll tell you again, these stories are all true. You don't believe them, but they're all true. Back in the day, because I was doing this online marketing thing, and I had this site, and I was selling this book, the first one. And I used to tell everybody exactly what you've just said. And you should build a subscriber base and have a newsletter.
Yeah.
So I had this subscription form on the web page, yeah, for people to sign up for this e-marketing newsletter. And then one day I got a phone call from a guy, not an email. He'd gone out of his way to track me down. Said, Mike, I signed up for the newsletter X weeks or months ago, whatever it was, and for some reason I'm not receiving it. Could you is there some problem, do you think, that I have with my email, whatever it is? And I didn't dare say to him, it's because I haven't even written it yet. And I said, I'm sorry, I've no idea why you're not receiving it. I put the phone, I was like, shit, I better write a newsletter. So I swear, back then, I swear, I brought in 3 or 4 friends and said, I need some content for a newsletter to go out tomorrow. What do you want us to write about? Write about your kids. I don't write. Just give me something. And then the following day, this is true. I'm honestly not making it up. I went to have a look at the subscription form because it was dropping into this little database that I had, obviously. And I went to go and have a look at it. And there were 3,500 email addresses. And I'd never even looked at it because I had nothing to give me an alert. Because I just thought this thing's only up there for show. I didn't know people were actually going to subscribe to it, like I say. So then I go and have a look at it. I was like, holy crap, write a newsletter, guy. So I did. Anyway, it's still there. And it's so funny to look at because it's this tiny little square thing made out of hand-coded HTML. But it's got interviews with like a developer from Google from way back then. It's got interviews with people from Tioma and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, and I look at it and people say to me, have you seen the state of that website? I go, I know, I loved it way back in the day.
And how long did you leverage your list for? Do you still even have your list? Do you still
So the
have
lists, so the list stayed with me until there was an acquisition and there was a legal thing that went around this, and I can't talk about it. And the list ended up there, and they used it to spam a lot of people, and that was it. That was the end of the list. They didn't know how to do it. So, I'm sorry, but don't spam people, man. Seriously, you don't have to.
Yeah.
Anticipated, relevant, and welcome. You don't need to spam people.
So coming back to the conferences, so search engine strategies. You said you're at the second one. Where was the second one, and when was the second one?
Dallas.
Right. What did
And
that?
and so Dallas was and that was so in Dallas. Yeah, I was going to that one in 2000, I think 2001, whatever it was. Sorry, so far back. I have to trying to. But yeah, so that's kind of another interesting thing that I told you. I got in touch with Danny. I had sent him an email about this thing, and it featured in the search engine report, which was the newsletter that he sent out at that time. And then I sent him an email saying, I need to speak to you about this conference that's coming up. Would you give me a telephone number? So he gave me the telephone number. Now, Danny's from California, and I'm like, I was still in Newcastle then, in the UK. And I was dialing this number going, this is California? Really? Anyway, the phone answers. It's Danny's. Hi, Danny Sullivan. Say, hey, Danny, it's Mike. I hope it's whatever time it was. It's not too late with you being in California. He said, Mike, I'm in London. So what are you doing? What are you doing in London? Expecting to say I'm on vacation. He said, I live here.
Yeah. So your very first conference, the second SES. Can you remember who was speaking and who was there?
Yeah, that was kind of an interesting one. So that's where I met Danny in person for the first time. I've actually got pictures from that one. You should see it. Yeah, it was. Strangely enough, Craig Silverstein from Google was speaking at that one. The reps from Alta Vista. There were so many search engines around at the time, but I think probably there were people on the main stage of that one, and then there were round tables. And on the round tables, there were a couple of girls, Jill Whalen being one of them. And if you go back and track, again, in terms of forums, for particularly where it comes to search, Jill probably had the very first forum, and that was her first conference as well. And Jill had started, she started a parenting website.
Yeah.
That's what she did. And she realized when she started the parenting website, the same thing as me. She couldn't get it to rank at Alta Vista or whatever it was. So she started kind of just experimenting and stumbled across this thing that eventually be called search engine optimization. I never liked the term SEO. I hate to use it. And I was completely against it when people were, kind of debating on what to call it. But I've been in the industry, like I say now, for 26, whatever it is, years. And I've never met anybody who's optimized a search engine. We could have been web page optimizers, content optimizers, what I refer to now, even with the teams that I work with at the agency in the US, to everybody else, they're SEOs. To me, they're CEA, content experience analysts. That's the job. That's what they do, content experience, as opposed to just trying to, rank at a search engine. That's the job. That's what they do, content experience, as opposed to just trying to, rank at a search engine. Anyway, sorry, I'm going off at a tangent. So Jill was at the Dallas conference, and all of the people that were there got to know Jill, and that was great for her because it built up the subscriptions to what became the high rankings forum, I think she called it.
Right.
Yeah, high rankings. Yeah. Anyway, I think it was high rankings forum, and that's where I met Amon, I believe, and everybody else. So just about everybody in the early days that you'll talk to, I guarantee at some point in time they were hanging around Jill's forum. And then Brett Tabke had already started Webmaster World.
Right.
Brett had been around on the internet for a long time as well. People don't realize this. He didn't come in as an SEO. He's a computer programmer who'd been running a bulletin board on the internet before the World Wide Web. So it was only natural when the web came around that he would start this forum. So he had Webmaster World and Search Engine World. And those were his forums. And Webmaster World and Jill's forum for a period in time, that's where the industry started to build up. It was like cottage industry building up there. And then actually third in a row was Search Engine Watch. That came in after Webmaster World and after Jill's forum.
Just going to the very first PubCon.
Well, yeah, again, there's debate about that. I mean, we know that it was a conference in a pub, but Brett said, no, it's the Publishers Conference.
Were you at that
Publishers
first
Conference.
one?
I was, yeah. It was. Sorry. Just some of the amazing things that have happened in this industry with conferences. You just reminded me about Mackin. So probably, I don't know, 2003 or 4 or thereabouts. And this is relevant, by the way. I get an email from Mackin saying that they're going to do webmaster. I think they just called them webmaster roundtables as opposed to PubCon, but it was still the same group, yeah. And he said we're going to do webmaster roundtable in Edinburgh in Scotland. You know, Mike's from North Carolina, I think. You know, he said anyway, we're coming to Edinburgh in Scotland, and you have to come along, Grehan, and blah 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 blah. That was the first conference my wife ever came to with me, and I actually thought that the Webmaster Roundtable was kind of like small seminar kind of thing, but it was just another booze up that Mike had arranged. So I get there with my wife, and she's just seen a bunch of guys talking about SEO, like, and she's like, "This is dull as shit." People just talking about getting drunk and talking about SEO at the tables, but there was no format, no real format for it. And the reason that I mentioned this one completely bizarrely is because even I felt when they were doing this, and there were guys like my friend Ralph Tegtmeyer, otherwise known as Phantom Master. Ralph and I had known each other from way back in the day. I mean, he was the real first Black Hat guy. And he'd come over from Germany, and people were traveling from all over the place. And then Brett came to me and said, Mike, there's this guy, Eddie Choi. I said, yeah, I know of Eddie. I haven't met him. He said, yes, he's flown here from Hong Kong, and his wife thinks there's going to be a conference. And she's waiting for this. She's waiting for the sessions to start. And of course, there is no agenda. It's just get drunk and hang out. So he said, would you mind holding a conference session, just one conference session, so that Eddie's wife can so I had to arrange a fake conference panel with Dave Naylor. I do know Dave and Dave from Richmond, and just hold just one conference session because Eddie's wife was going nuts, saying we've flown all the way from Hong Kong to get drunk with some people. Eddie Choi and I are the greatest friends. I mean, Eddie is like a brother to me. And I used to work out of Hong Kong. I had an office there for a long time when I was running SES out there as well. But I mean, I first opened an office in Hong Kong, I think, in 2005. So I've known Eddie for a long time. And every time I go to Hong Kong, Eddie says to his wife, Mike's coming. She's like, I'll see you tomorrow.
Oh my goodness. Just to put some pieces together. So could you just tell me, Ralph, Phantom Master, could you just go back to how you met him and how you know him? Because Phantom Master is obviously a really fascinating character. I'm interested to know as to when you met him.
So how did I meet Ralph? I think I met Ralph because I was doing some investigating around Black Hat techniques. of which I was kind of using quite a few myself. um,
What year
and
would it have been? About 95, I think?
2000, 2001
Oh, okay.
is when we'd started really doing, redirecting and cloaking, as it became,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it was Ralph that actually gave the term cloaking. And basically it was just kind of IP sniffing, anybody who came and got redirected to this page, and if it was Google, it got redirected to that page. I mean, that was just I forgot to mention, I think at the first SES in San Francisco, that one is where the whole spamming cloaking thing started, the whole black hat thing. And I actually was the person who coined the term black hat. We'll come back to that in a second if you want. But I actually coined the term. I wish I hadn't, but I coined the term black hat. However, at that very first conference, given that I said legend about, them opening the cart and pulling the T-shirts out, it was at that conference that Sergey Brin said, and with our algorithm, with PageRank, we can't be spammed.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, you might regret saying that, believe me, because from then on, it was game on with Google, and I don't think that even they realized just how bad it was going to be, But Ralph had, God, how do we? I met him really on, and he had developed his own software for cloaking, and eventually he ended up. Most people don't realize, although he's recognized as one of the top black hat guys. This is a super smart guy we're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
by the way, Ralph was born in Egypt. His parents are archaeologists, and he speaks 4 different languages fluently. I mean, he's a really, really smart guy, and obviously got into the technology. But he developed into a slightly different path in that he was developing these very early bots, and we had this thing called the Phantom Blaster. Ask me to describe the Phantom Blaster if you want to talk about how spam really worked back in the day. It was this incredible thing, but he was actually selling the software to the black hats. Yes, he was doing his own stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but he was creating and then selling the software.
Yeah.
And I bought his software, and he and I, um, you'll see, I think in the second edition of the book, I did an interview with Ralph. There's an interview with him in there. So I think I probably did that one around about 2000. So I must have known Ralph for quite some time. I love Ralph. He's a great guy. He's a bit black magic, but I mean real black magic. I'm not talking black hat. I mean,
Yeah.
but great guy.
How did you come to coin the term black hat? Where did that come from?
So there was a guy called Peter Devanzo who early in the day, and Peter's down in New Zealand, and Peter started searchengineblog.com, the real first blog, and he was blogging. He's a funny guy, comedic kind of guy as well, really talented guy, and he read the book 20 years ago and wanted to interview me about it. So he sent me he sent me a list of questions that he wanted me to answer about the book, doing an email interview with me. And most of the answers came straight from the bottle of Jack Daniels that I had with me at the time. But I was just having so much fun with him. And one of the questions that he had in there was about Google and Google guidelines. And then I wrote these words that I'd been doing all of these nefarious things, bait and switch and all of these kind of things that people were now saying you shouldn't do because it's against Google's guidelines. And I said I was driving home one evening, driving home down Dark Country Lane one evening, and this spacecraft arrived in front of me, and it was landing, and all I could hear was it was saying this word. It sounded like goggle or something like that. It turned out to be Google, and they sucked me up into this spacecraft. And then minutes later, I was on my own in a field, and I realized that my coal black hat had turned snowy white. And that's where the term black hat, white hat came from.
Oh my, honestly, this is
that interview's still around. I've got to tell you, Shelley, I still show it to people now. If I'll send you a copy of the interview, even when I read it now, it's like, yeah, he asked me, he, he asked me about my background, and the first words that I wrote was, "I was born at a very early age," and then it just went on from there.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Coming back to Google. So reading your book, there's some really excellent, really interesting interviews in there, particularly the Andre from Alta Vista and also the Craig Silverstein. Craig Silverstein, he was
Really important. Sorry for interrupting. Yeah, the two really important interviews that got so much traction back in the day. The one with Craig Silverstein. We'll talk about that more in a second. The interview with Andre Broder. So Andre Broder wrote probably the most profound piece of information, the scientific paper that he wrote, which is called A Taxonomy of Search. And I still introduce that to people now, 23 years later, okay, talking about understanding intent. So I was so lucky. I got the only interview with the scientist who wrote the paper. And Andre Broder is actually now distinguished engineer at Google. But what he actually pointed out in there was informational, navigational, transactional. Yes. And so I wrote about that a lot. And I explained to people, if you develop content around this, is not, I said, this is not three different people. This is a cognitive process we go through in search, okay? Informational, navigational, transactional. And I say, if you develop content around that, and even now people are only beginning to understand, to develop content around intent. And it drives me nuts, Shelley, because I go, when people talk to me about that, I go, I've been saying this for 23 years. Yeah. The interview with Craig Silverstein.
Yeah.
That was interesting because when I first started, you asked me this question, I think, about, interacting with search engines. When I first started interacting with Google, there was about 38 people there. I could call them and they would answer the phone. They were working out of a garage. I mean, seriously, I could call. So I called and spoke to Christy Kirst, but the first PR person that they had there, and said, I'd like to interview Craig Silverstein. Craig was the first employee of Google, by the way. He's employee number one.
Yeah.
Apart from the founders who were not employees.
Yeah.
Well,
was
anyway,
he CTO?
He was the first.
Is that right?
He was the chief technology officer when they brought him in. Yeah. And I just said, can I interview him? And they just said, yeah, why not? So I'm like, shit, this is cool. So I met Craig and I did that interview with him. I actually did 3, but that very first one was phenomenal. The amount of traction I got in the industry because he was answering any question I asked him.
Yeah.
And one of the most important questions that I asked is, I told him quite honestly, if you read the interview, I said, one of the things that I've noticed about Google, amongst the many things that I've noticed, because man, I've been spamming you from day one. One of the things that I've noticed is many popular queries actually return a .gov, .gov, or a .edu. Yeah, and certainly anything not just academic, but on medical, because we were making websites for Viagra at the time. So even medical terms nearly always return a .edu. So the .edu must be a really important thing. And if you read that in there, he explains, he said, yes, we do actually give a little bit of a lift to a .edu, because if you're going to do a search for something like cancer cure, we think a .edu, an academic institution, will probably be more reliable than getyourcancercure.com kind of thing, And that created a storm, because I then wrote after that, and you can find it somewhere, I think, on Search Engine Watch, the importance of getting a link from a .edu. If you can get a link from a university...
Oh, are you to blame for that then?
That's me, absolutely. That was the first time that it was mentioned by the chief technology officer at Google. I mean, I got what I wanted from him. He got a few things from me. We could come back to that. But the .edu thing was so important because I'd already written about Donald Kleinberg's algorithm called HITS, which is hypertext induced topic search. And I wrote a special paper on that. But if you read the book, I look at both PageRank and at HITS. and explain the importance of links and why not all links are equal. Some are much more equal than other links, and that's why .edu is important, you know. So understanding these two algorithms. So that's why I was saying it's not about the quantity of links, it's always been about the quality of the link. So then everybody started working on the fact, wow, if we can just get links from a university.
So tell me, obviously, if you had like, you know, an inside track with Craig and Google, what some of the things, can you share anything with me? Obviously now we've got 20 years in the rearview mirror. Is there anything that he told you that you discussed that you've never shared online before that you can share now?
No, I mean, he was quite, he played his cards close to his chest then, the same as everybody else did, because they suddenly realized now what you don't understand, Shelley, and this is really important. I met with the guys from Alta Vista, which was the big search engine before Google. And because we're talking about the internet and the World Wide Web, and I said that Alta Vista were building this, you know, it's going to rule the world. It's the world's supercomputer. I mean, the world's supercomputer back then was a 386 machine. You know, I mean, seriously, this thing that we carry around in our hand now is 100 times more powerful than Alta Vista was back in the day. And so kind of a little bit of what I learned from Craig at the time is the difficulty that they have dealing with spam. They get so, the same as Alta Vista did, they told me, they get so much of it, because people are trying so hard to rank that it ruins the results for everybody else. So now they spend the whole of their time trying to eliminate spam because the end user experience is the most important thing. So the kind of understanding that I had with Craig was not a case of you tell me stuff that I'm not supposed to know. It's like you tell me stuff that's relevant and important, that I can use without revealing too much. The .edu thing, I think you let that one slip, to be honest. And I'll try and do my best to get the community, because I have got a platform there to help Google. So in a couple of interviews I did with him, so that one in particular, if you read that interview again, he mentions the thing about edu, but then there's this beautiful little chunk that he wants in there about, can we tell webmasters that if they were to name images correctly, it would be much more important to Google, instead of just saying JPEG 1, JPEG 2, or GIF 1, or GIF 2, or GIF 100, if they could actually say picture of a bird, or if they could actually say, cupcake, or they could actually say whatever it is in the picture. And he made a little bit of that around usability, because obviously people with visual disability couldn't see. So you fit that in with access, that kind of thing. But the real reason that he wanted that is to get as many images that they could, because they had just started doing image search back then. And that was J-Lo, she wore this dress at the the Grammys. What year was that? Anyway, she wore this really revealing dress, very low cut dress. There were so many searches for J-Lo's dress that Google eventually realized, wow, image search is really big. They want to do this. So they started building it. But because of the way that they were using machine learning early on, there are two ways of doing that. There's three really. There's supervised, unsupervised, and kind of there is semi-supervised in between for machine learning. But it's a much easier thing to do if you tag. So what he was actually making sure was that while they were training the machines, we actually explain what the picture is, and then it makes it much easier to be able to classify and categorize those images. So Google's always done that. There's a bit of a trade-off. We'll give you a little bit of something. Here's something that would be good. And when Google says, wouldn't it be a good thing? Even Muller says now, if you did this, that would be good for the end user. And we go, oh, that's secret code for ranking. Well, when he says it's good for the end user, it's obviously good for Google as well, because it makes something else easier. Exactly.
But it's clear that there are still a lot of black hat or techniques that work that are deemed, outside of rules, etc., and guidelines. Do you think, to a degree, Google is tolerating those until they become, but then at the point they become too spoken about too widely, that's when they'll start to penalize them? Do you think they do
I
that
don't think there's
actively?
as much around. I don't think it's as easy now as it was before, and there are reasons for that. I mean, people talked about page rank. If you go back to that early newsletter that I mentioned, I spoke to a lot of people, certainly those on the commercial side, on the academic side, because I got to speak to, I've been a member of ACM, which is the world's largest computing society, and I've been a member of ACM, a senior member in the Information Retrieval Special Interest Group, and that's where I've been living my life. So I get to learn a lot um, about what's happening on the IR side. There was always conjecture about whether PageRank actually worked or not. In theory, it's a great thing. But back in the day, given what I've just said about the power of computers, then computing one page rank was difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Computing many page ranks,
Yeah.
this. So people used to say, "Oh, in order to do that, you'll need a server farm the size of Texas and all the lightning in the world to run it and that kind of thing." We have reached a point now, given what I've just said, looking at iPhones, the power that we have now, and Google has been using machine learning since day one,
Mm-hmm.
using what they call support vector machines. So they've been doing it since day one. The reason I'm at length telling you all of this is previously I didn't believe that they could make PageRank work. I believe they can now. So these things, these new filters that they put in, these algorithm changes, Penguin and whatever it is, all of these kind of things, these are developed now out of the super computing power that they have, that they can do in real time. So, when it comes down to a link spam and those kind of things, and that's why these things that they put in place really do work, because they can actually do it. So it is much harder. Yes, I mean, with brute force, and you can take any kind of bank in the world that you want, and somebody will find a way to rob it.
Yeah,
It's as
sure.
simple as that. And you can
Um,
take cryptocurrency. I saw on TV today, two people in New York have just swindled $4.5 billion out of crypto, and that's supposed to be the safest things. I got away with so many things with spamming back in the day, cloaking some of the stuff that I did. But I was always really keen to make sure that the end user experience was right. So, because I did a lot of stuff using Flash, which is not around
uh-huh.
anymore, but I did back then. So I had to do some cloaking. I had to do
Yeah.
that was kind of important at the time to do that kind of
Mm.
thing. But I think that smarter marketers these days, even in competitive markets, can think of better ways to do promotion online to get better visibility than looking to see if there's an unfair advantage somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
The amount of
Mm-hmm.
time and effort that it takes to try and find the unfair advantage,
To get the
you could have just had a
loophole.
brilliant
Yeah,
idea anyway.
yeah. Is it true they were obviously in the beginning, the balance of power is the SEOs, obviously, I know you don't like that term, but people who were online marketers in the early
Yeah,
days,
we're stuck with it.
they
It's
were very they had all the power, and Google actually used to come to speak to a lot of the search marketing guys and get information off them. But then, is it true that, and then eventually, until it got to a tipping point, and then where Google had all the balance of power and then they started to dictate? Is that right? Would you say?
So I think there was this kind of jousting thing that was going on all of the time between the two sides. I mean, the minute that Google managed to figure out a way to stop some kind of spam that was going on, particularly with links more than anything else, and in keyword stuffing that people still do and don't fully understand what it is. Um, so there was certainly that, but I think the conference, as SES grew and went from that small thing in 1999, by the time I took over and was doing that, there was 6,000 people a time going to New York and San Francisco conferences. They
What
were
year did you take over, Mike?
2009. I mean,
2009, right? So before, yeah.
yes, yeah, that number had grown from where, I mean, Danny actually took it to the peak. I mean, it could have been bigger around about 2006, 2006, I think, seven,
Yeah.
around about that time. And Ad Tech, which was the other conference, the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
But anyway, there were multiple thousands of people going to the conference, and Google had learned along the way as the early sponsors that keep your friends close and keep your enemies closer. So they would go to the conference to see if they could find a Phantom Master or a Dave Naylor. I mean, Dave Naylor was a master of the art, and probably still is back then, very, very well recognized. The Greg Boza back in the day, there were a lot of those guys, and frequently you would find them hanging out with Matt Cutts from Google, and thinking, you're many pretty smart guys, yeah, but he's only grilling you to find out what he can. So
God, wouldn't you have just loved to have been a fly on the wall in those conversations?
So I mean, I knew Matt very well. Well, so to say very as well as he would let people get to know him, because he was around in the industry. But that's another thing, with the book. I did 2 90-minute interviews when I started my podcast in 2007, which was a bit ahead of everybody else. So I started a podcast then, and my first guest was Matt Cutts. And if you go back and listen to some of the stuff that we talked about then, again, that was a huge thing. That interview was, downloaded by so many people. But if you think about it this way, back in the day, there was this dearth of information. It was very, very hard to find. And so there were only people like me and Danny. Danny was a great journalist reporting on everything as a practitioner. I was doing kind of a lot of black hat, but I was working with very large clients at the time. And like I say, I was doing a lot of research. Eventually you begin to find out what works and what doesn't work.
What can you think back and remember what kind of time it was that balance tipped over where Google started to have more dominance over the industry?
So Google's rise was absolutely magnificent. It was like a meteorite. It was just, they shot up there. And the reason for that is that Alta Vista, although it had become the most popular, was predominantly keyword based. It was easy enough to spam, like I say. It was mainly based, and it was using you mentioned vector space model before, the Sultan theory. That comes from Sultan's original modern information retrieval book. It's a very hard concept to get your head around, but basically it's all about keywords, yes. And so and this is kind of important. So you get this guy, Donald Kleinberg, who is probably the foremost computer scientist in the world. He's won every award ever. And around about the time that Alta Vista was the #1 search engine, Kleinberg went to Alta Vista and started doing some searches and looking at how poor the results were. So he did a search for, I believe the first time he did this was like Japanese automobile manufacturer, and started looking at the results at Alta Vista. And there was like some secondhand car dealership in LA and something like, but like there was no Nissan, no Toyota, none of the recognized manufacturers. So he actually went to their websites and realized that none of the largest Japanese automotive manufacturers had the words Japanese automotive manufacturer written anywhere on their websites. And that's why they couldn't be found. So yeah, you could go and say, put these in your title tag, that kind of thing. That might make a difference. What he thought was, because he was looking at network theory at the time, and he's one of the leaders in the field, and he thought to himself, what about the linkage data? So he started working on this algorithm, HITS, hypertext induced topic search, which is keyword dependent. At exactly the same time, Google was working on their idea, which is PageRank, which is keyword independent. So there's a big difference between the two, but they're very, very similar in the approach, in that it's let's look at a community. So when he'd finished with HITS and ran it, I'll not go into the technology around it, but when it eventually converged, looking at linkage data for the same query, looking at linkage data, right at the top was Toyota, right below that was Nissan, whatever it was, those kind of things. So what he discovered then, and what I've tried to explain to people again about why you shouldn't do this keyword stuffing, is it's not what you say about yourself on the page. You can see we are the world's greatest manufacturer of, yeah. But philosophically, what the algorithm is saying is, who else thinks so? And the only way they'll know that is by who links to you and what's in that link anchor text. Do they say world's greatest manufacturer of something? So that's why linkage data and link anchor text became so important. But Alta Vista wasn't built for that. So when Google came in and looking at linkage data, yeah, and ranking according to links, the results were so much better than you were seeing at Alta Vista. And Alta Vista really couldn't compete. Eventually they said, yes, we do look at links, we are doing this. But by that time, Google had already taken off. And the other thing is, not just in the industry, Google had this unique look about them. It's a clean white page with just a box and Google written underneath it. I was talking to Marissa Mayer, who was one of the first employees. She went on to become CEO at Yahoo, as you know, but she was one of the early. In fact, she was dating Page back in the day.
Oh,
She was
really?
yeah, she was dating the Larry Page. They were engaged. They were going to get married. Yeah. Not a lot of people know that.
I didn't know that.
Anyway, I met her a few times at conferences, and this came up in a conversation at dinner one evening, and she said, everybody thinks it was such a great idea. The fact of the matter is that Larry and Sergey didn't know how to do HTML. That was the best that they could manage, just put a logo in a box. That's what, but they actually didn't like all of the clutter that went on the other websites, because the other websites referred to themselves as portals.
Yeah,
Like Alta
so
Vista was a
distracting.
portal.
Yeah.
Okay, so you would go to the portal, and there it was. There was star signs and a bit of news and a this and an ad for that, and then somewhere there was this little square box. I've got to tell you this one because this is true as well. That and again, it was Marissa who mentioned this to me. That at some point, Google were looking at analytics around this homepage, this clean white homepage, and they couldn't figure out why it was that it took so long when people landed on the page to actually do something, type the query in. People would sit for 30, 40, 50, even a minute. Sometimes they would sit and then they would type the query, and they just couldn't figure out why is it that this happens with some people. And they got Jacob Nielsen, who is the usability expert, who he actually sat as an advisor on the board with Google back in the day. So Jacob did some UX. He was doing usability analysis around the page, and he realized what it was. And the fact of the matter is that because this was so different, this clean white page that nobody had encountered before. Yeah. When I was talking about loading times before, so if you went to Alta Vista, you'd have to sit and wait for all of this stuff to load in. Yes.
They thought it was waiting to load.
Exactly. So they would go to Google and sit there and wait for all the crap to load in, star signs and stuff like, and then eventually go, oh, this is it. And then they would type think about it. But Nielsen came up with a great idea. I mean, talk about psychology in usability. That if you go to any page and scroll down to the bottom of the page, the last thing you see at the page is a little C, yes, and the date next to it, copyright and the date. So the only thing that used to be on the page was the logo and the little box, and he put C 2001 underneath, and as soon as people saw the copyright sign, oh, that's it. It's just a psychological thing, because that's usually the last thing that you see.
Yeah. What do you miss about it back then?
I do actually miss the community and knowledge sharing, which was genuine at the time. Because, I use this word dearth, which means literally there was so little. There were no authorities. There were no... I mean, Danny was there reporting. I was doing what I could. You could go to a conference and people from search engines would turn up. They don't very often now. They would speak. They would give you information. But basically, it would be more about doing stuff that they wanted you to do, and then a lot of propaganda that goes with it. But then you would meet in the corridors and in the bars later on and those kind of things. and then share information. And there was probably a lot more shared, even by the speakers and the kind of thought leaders around at that time, that they would share with you at the bar that they wouldn't share
Yeah,
on the stage if
yeah.
Google was there, you know.
As I said earlier, you know, we've got 20 years in the rear view mirror now. Could you share with me one interesting technique that you were using back then that you would never shared back then, but now you could tell me about?
Yeah, with Phantom Master, the one thing that, and it probably still works now, to be honest, but it was incredible. The story about Ralph. I mean, I love Ralph. He's such a great guy, a very funny guy as well. But he and I became great friends. Anyway, he developed this thing that, like I say, referred to as the Phantom Blaster. Yeah,
Yeah.
and basically, there was a crawler that he developed, and the crawler would go out and it would just go and steal web pages with certain keywords on. Okay, so let's say you were trying to rank for running shoes. Okay, so the crawler would go out and it would just go around thousands and thousands of pages that had the words running shoes, title tag, you know, H1 tags. You know, just find all of those pages and bring copies of all of those pages down, yes, and then jumble all of the words up on the page, yeah, except for the keywords still in the same place. So that, again, from a copyright point of view, you couldn't say you'd stolen, because it was mumbo jumbo, completely mumbo jumbo, except all of the keywords were still in the title tag, still in the H1 tag. And then wait for this. So you get all of this content together, and then by .cn, okay, so Chinese domain names, yeah, back then were about 25 cents each. so you buy 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 .cn, 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 .cn. Well, didn't matter what it was, just buy these Chinese domain names, yeah, and then upload 100,000 pages, cross-link all of the pages for running shoes. Honestly, just create what was called a shadow domain. Okay, so you create the shadow domain, and now the shadow domain itself is up there. It's a target that Google can find easily, but it used to get all of this traffic, and then you fire the traffic from the shadow domain to the actual brand,
To the actual,
and nobody
so
could
that's
do
the
anything to
buffer.
brand. Exactly, because brand didn't do anything except receive traffic, which it's allowed to do. So then Google finds this shadow domain, this fake network, and pulls it down. And 30 minutes later, there's another one. And then they find it and put it, and 30 minutes later, there's another one. So Ralph just kept doing this over and over again. And of course, working with Ralph, I used it a few times. I'm not going to talk too much about how it was used, but you can see how that thing, you pull down the shadow domain, yeah, but you can't, wherever it was sending the traffic, whatever it was doing, you can't touch shirt brand. So, you know, it was kind of a perfect kind of thing. I tell you what's even funnier is that the shadow domain actually became like the worst offense that you could ever create at Google. So in the Google guidelines, they wrote in it, and the one thing you should never do is a shadow domain. So everybody's Googling shadow domain and finding Ralph's website and buying his software. It was the best ad you could ever have had.
Oh, wow. That's just
So
amazing.
yeah, shadow domain, that was a very hard one to beat, believe me.
I'm going to have to speak to Ralph, I think, and get his
Yeah.
version as well.
I mean, he is cemented into the industry, 100% black hat. That's for sure. I mean, it didn't matter what he was doing. He knows for a fact he could still build a website, white hat, and win, but he'd still do black hat anyway.
Well, for the show today, I think I'm just going to wrap up there, Mike, because that's just, I think, a brilliant final story to end on. So I'm just going to say thank you very much for your time joining us today, and thank you very much.
There's a lot to talk about. Let's do it all again some other time, yeah?
Thank you, Mike. Bye.
All right, great meeting you. Bye.